We're going to move on into the community and economic impact, the St. Croix River crossing, St. Croix County perspective.
Yeah. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. We've heard in a couple different ways this morning. We've heard made references to the St. Croix River crossing project. This morning we have a report on the fiscal and economic development opportunities created by the St. Croix River crossing project. There was a study recently conducted to try to examine how the new crossing will influence St. Croix County, our population growth and economic development opportunities, and provide communities like New Richmond and all the communities in St. Croix County with information and tools for planning for economic development and growth because of the new river crossing project, and provide opportunities and suggestions to communities to shape that growth and try to plan for it. This morning we have two gentlemen, Matt Kurz. Matt is employed with the UW Extension Office out of Madison, employed in the Center for Community and Economic Development. He works in extension with communities, providing these types of reports, working with community leaders. We also have Mr. Tom Gillespie from Gillespie Demographics, and Tom served as the Minnesota State demographer for over 30 years. He's currently retired and self-employed with Gillespie Demographics. So I'd like to introduce both Matt and Tom, who will present the report to the county board this morning. Gentlemen, welcome.
You bring it up over there. Okay, excellent. Well, good morning, everyone. Mr. Chair, County Board members, thank you for the invitation to present some work that we've been doing to you over the past 6 months or so, looking at the community and economic impacts of the new river crossing. And while we've been working on this for about the past 6 months, this is something that's been in the plans for about a year now. We were brought on board by the Community Development Department and our former UW Extension Conrad agent, Pete Kling, to look at this back in September of 2013. So over this time, we've had an opportunity to talk to a lot of people, to look at a lot of information, and make some to identify some key findings that are going to be important to communities and to St. Croix County as a whole moving forward. Again, I'm Matt Kuris. I'm with UW Extension out of Madison. I have been with the Center for Community and Economic Development for about 13 years now, and it's been a great opportunity to work with you locally here. You have to advance it there?
You should, no, you should.
Oh, I should have control?
You should be able to. No? Sorry.
That's okay. Yep. So as we just heard, there is a lot of uncertainty facing the crossing. We really don't know what the true impacts of the crossing are going to be on the county, as well as communities that sit at kind of the foot of the crossing. So we have a couple of broad study goals that we want to keep in mind as we're talking about the findings today. And really we want to talk about how we can broadly understand how the river crossing could impact the region's future economy, tax base, and provision of services. And we say could because we can look at a lot of information, we can talk to a lot of people, we can make a lot of assessments, but it's really hard to identify what the exact impacts are going to be. So we're trying to use the best information that we can have at our hands to look at how it could affect the county and communities. That said, we do want to give communities a lot of information to help them better plan going forward. So we want to help them understand what the economic impacts might be. But we also want to give them some tools to help them identify what the fiscal impacts may be on their communities. With growth brings new revenues to communities, but it also brings new costs. So one of the things we try and do is identify what some of the fiscal impacts may be so they can do future planning in terms of what it means for community services, what the impacts may be on school districts, what the impacts may be on public works, and so on and so forth. We also want to identify opportunities for shaping future growth. And we can, again, provide a lot of information on the river crossing and what it may mean going forward. But really, communities have an opportunity to shape their growth. We know that growth is going to come, but how it appears in communities is really up to them to some degree. What this study does not do, this is not a land use plan. We're not trying to identify or dictate certain types of land use that may occur in communities. Again, communities have those opportunities to shape that growth themselves, and we're not here to try and say what that growth may look like and where it may occur. We're not trying to pinpoint the exact impacts on communities. Because of the nature of doing population projections, of forecasting future economic growth, it is very hard to say where a specific type of opportunity will occur in a community. So we're trying to look at this from more of a broad perspective. And finally, this is not a comprehensive economic development strategy. We'll provide a lot of information that will help communities develop strategies to grow their economies, but again, it is not a comprehensive strategy for a given community or for the entire county. Next slide, please. With that, before we get into too much detail on the study, I do want to recognize some individuals who have been very instrumental in making this project happen. Ellen, Amanda, and Brett with the Community Development Department have been very, very helpful and insightful in driving this process forward. Certainly Agnes Ring, as part of the chair of the Community Development Committee here in St. Croix County, has been very useful and helpful in providing insights. And then we've also had a committee of community members throughout all sorts of different sectors, public and private, that have been instrumental in making this process go forward. And you'll see them on the screen there, and my apologies if I've forgotten anyone, but I just want you to know that this has been driven by the community as well. It's not just outsiders coming in and making recommendations or identifying findings. As I mentioned, the study focus is St. Croix County and the so-called corridor communities. And I think the county is an important level of analysis because when you look at a lot of the studies that have been done for the river crossing, a lot of them have been done on the Minnesota side, and a lot of them have been pinpointed for communities such as the town of St. Joseph. But there are going to be broader impacts that occur in St. Croix County as well. And we also recognize that just because of the geographic location of the river crossing and the highway distribution that comes out of the river crossing, that it's going to have unique impacts on a number of individual communities as well, primarily along the Highway 64 corridor. So when we say corridor communities, we're looking at a number of 8 different municipalities. We're looking at the village of Star Prairie, the town of Star Prairie, the city of New Richmond, the town of Richmond, the town of St. Joseph, the village of North Hudson, and the village and town of Somerset. So if you hear corridor communities, those are the 8 municipalities that we're talking about. So I'd like to shape today's presentation around some key findings that we've come across as part of this process, but also those that have been identified as part of the work with the study committee that I mentioned just a minute ago. And I think this one's very important, and it's that infrastructure improvements can be seen as a catalyst for change, but are neither necessary nor sufficient to guarantee economic and population growth rates in surrounding areas. The fact is that it's very difficult to isolate the impacts of infrastructure improvements on a given community or on a county. The reality is that there are many, many factors that drive population and economic growth. It's an area's demographic makeup, it's its socioeconomic conditions, it's its land use, it's its labor force, it's its business climate. There's all these other factors that go into how a community grows over time. That said, enhanced or new highways or other transportation infrastructure in suburban areas generally have a positive influence on population and economic growth. One way they do this is to create efficiencies in terms of transporting goods and services into and out of communities, but they also improve access to jobs in the metropolitan area, and we'll go into this a little more detail here in a second. So to say that it's difficult to isolate the growth impacts is true, but it's also important to recognize that for the most part, transportation improvement do tend to have a positive influence. It's also important to recognize, though, that when you look at population growth in a community or economic growth in a community, some of the biggest factors that you see in what happens in the future are actually what happened in the past. If a community was growing in the past, it tends to grow in the future. If a community was not growing in the past, there's a good chance it may not grow in the future as well. So keeping that in mind, one of the things that the river crossing actually can do is help facilitate that future growth to continue. Now, it may not be the same as it was in the past, but it does help it continue to grow in several ways. And importantly, because of how communities make decisions about where growth occurs and how it might occur in a community, decisions that are made in one community are going to influence what happens in neighboring communities. What happens in the town of St. Joseph is going to impact what happens in the city of New Richmond. The reality is that communities along this corridor are going to have to partner with one another to understand what the growth and impacts are going to be on their communities, because it's going to connect them even more so than they already are. Are there any questions on that? And I would encourage you, if you do have questions, that we move along here, because this is a lot of information to throw at you on a Tuesday morning. Please feel free to ask as we go forward. Next slide, please. So because it is difficult to isolate the impacts of a given infrastructure project on future growth, one of the things that we did was to actually look at comparable communities around the United States that had also had a bridge improvement or a bridge expansion, and these were those that tended to be within the periphery of a large metropolitan area. And it's difficult to find a lot of comparable projects around the United States, but these were 5 that we thought were somewhat insightful for looking at the river crossing. And when I say comparable projects too, it's important to realize that these are not exact replicas of what we'll see in the river crossing. They're different in very many different reasons, but they do provide some insights. So the 5 that we looked at were the Highway 370 corridor, which is located outside of St. Charles County, Missouri, completed in 1996 and also part of the St. Louis metropolitan area. The Bloomington Ferry Bridge, which I think is a very relative one for you, given how close it is, and also part of the Minneapolis metropolitan area, also completed in 1996. The Arthur Ravenel Jr. Bridge, which is in Charleston County, South Carolina, completed in 2005. The Blenner-Hassett Bridge, which is spans between Ohio and West Virginia, completed in 2008. And the George P. Coleman Memorial Bridge in Gloucester County, Virginia. All of these are expansion projects that went from a smaller bridge to a 4-lane project within a metropolitan area. And this is an animation, so you may have to be a little ready there, Cindy.
Okay.
It's okay. So can you just hit it once, please? So this is the population change in St. Croix County starting in 1970 going out to 2012. So this is the percent change starting in 1970 and then the percent change between any given year in 1970. And you'll see a box there. And that box is also another improvement project that happened in St. Croix County, which was the improvement of the crossing of I-94 at Hudson. And what we can see is that if we look at the growth trends before and after the completion of that project, we can see that the growth actually started to occur before the project began. And that the growth rate right after the project for about the first decade or so was pretty similar to what happened before then. We see growth pick up later on, but it's after the infrastructure had been in place for some time. Could you hit the next? This is Scott County, Minnesota, where the Bloomington Ferry Bridge is located. And again, that box is when the bridge project was completed. One of the things you'll notice here is that certainly it's one of the fastest growing counties in the metropolitan area, but also it was growing pretty significantly before the bridge was completed, before the Bloomington Ferry Bridge. And that the growth rate, while it did pick up slightly after the bridge was completed, for the most part, it was growing fast already before the bridge was already there. Next one, please. This is St. Charles, Missouri. And again, the box is when the Discovery Bridge was completed. And again, you'll see almost an identical growth rate before and after that bridge project was completed. Next one, please. This is in Gloucester, Virginia. Again, a very similar trend. You'll see when the box there is when the bridge was completed. This is Charleston, South Carolina. And then the last one is the Wood County, West Virginia, Washington County, Ohio. It's hard to see there on the bottom. Again, this kind of echoes what we saw on the previous slide, that if a community was growing beforehand, it continued to grow after the project was completed. If a community was not growing or was growing at a slower rate, the bridge did not necessarily continue that or spur additional growth in those areas. And again, these are somewhat anecdotal. These are a limited number of case studies, but they do reinforce what we've seen in looking at a lot of research on transportation infrastructure, is that they tend to facilitate growth and they tend to encourage growth on a path that was already occurring before. We can do a similar type of analysis doing employment. So this is growth in employment in a county. Very similar to the chart that you saw before with population. Those bars that you see there are recessionary periods. And I think that's important when we look at employment growth, because we have to realize, as I mentioned before, that economic growth and population growth are also influenced by many other factors, one of which being national economic conditions. So here is St. Croix County, Wisconsin, and again you can see the growth before and after. Pretty similar to what happened with the population chart. Next one, please. These two are Scott County, Minnesota, and St. Charles County, Missouri. Again, very similar rates before and after these infrastructure projects. There you see the remaining three, the light blue being Gloucester, Virginia. Again, before and after, very similar. Same with Charleston, South Carolina, and same with Wood County, West Virginia. So again, the bridges themselves do not necessarily spur the growth, but they do help facilitate further growth going forward. Any questions on that? Okay, so one of the things we also did in looking at these comparison projects was not just compare population and employment growth. We also looked at other ways that the communities tried to respond to these projects occurring in their communities. So one of the things that we learned in talking to individuals in these different communities that had seen these infrastructure projects go forward is that they said that cross-community collaboration is very important, particular to economic development efforts. That they realize that they're part of a regional economy and that what goes on in one community is also going to benefit what goes on in another community because of commuter patterns and so on and so forth. So one of the things that we saw in Missouri is that they actually set up an economic development initiative called Discover 370, which is around the bridge, which linked all these communities together to help them sell the region as much as they sold their individual communities as well. You also saw them somewhat embrace some of the social, environmental, and economic impacts of the bridge. The bridge is already going to go up. It's already being constructed. So what they did was try and find key points that were important to each of these communities, and they tried to build upon them individually in each community. They also tried to maintain realistic expectations. And there's, as we said, a lot of uncertainty what may occur going forward. And there's also, I think, a lot of opinions that will say that it's going to spur a ton of growth or it may not spur any growth. And we don't know. But we have to try and use the data that's available to help us make those decisions going forward and keep it somewhat grounded in reality. And this one actually came from Shakopee, Minnesota, the final bullet point. And Shakopee sits at the base of the Bloomington Ferry Bridge, and they've seen pretty explosive growth over the last decade or so, actually over the last decade and a half. And what they suggested is that we overplan today for the future. Because of the uncertainty, we want to take all the information we have right now and try and plan for many, many contingencies that may come forward. Some of them may not occur, but if they do occur, you're ready for them to happen. You're not being reactive, you're being proactive. Our second key finding is that while infrastructure projects can facilitate future growth and help encourage future growth and do impact future growth, depending upon what your community was doing before, there are also broader growth trends in the county and metropolitan area that may influence future growth as well. And we have to recognize these. And these are driven by a number of larger demographic and economic shifts. I'm just going to cover some of these briefly, and then I'm going to turn it over to Tom to talk a little bit more about some of these trends and also some of the ways that he's used this information to project what population may look like going forward. So certainly the completion of the river crossing will influence future growth, no doubt about it. Historical demographic patterns are going to matter as well, and we'll look at an example of that here in a minute. We're still facing a changing housing market since 2005, and we have to realize that there are some economic conditions out there that are still creating a challenge for the housing market that we must recognize. Tom will talk a little bit more about the growth of the Twin Cities metropolitan area and how that may influence growth in St. Croix County. The population in terms of its age structure is changing as well. We are getting older across St. Croix County and across the metropolitan area and across the state of Wisconsin. And the prime housing buying segment moving forward will be the millennials. And there is some research out there that debates whether or not the housing preferences that these individuals will have going forward is the same as that same age group in the past. So one of the things that I think is important to realize is that St. Croix County's population growth is largely influenced by in-migration of individuals, people moving from other places into St. Croix County. And one of the things we can do is look at its migration signature in terms of how people have moved into and out of this county of different age groups. So this looks at the net migration rate of different age groups, starting at 0 to 4, going all the way up to 75 and over. And you'll see that baseline of 0. If you have a positive inflow of individuals, more people moving into a community than out of a community of a certain age group, you have a positive net migration and you'll have a value above that line. If there are more people moving out of the community than into the community of a certain age group, you'll have a negative net migration rate and you'll be below that line. So if you could just hit the first one. This looks at net migration rates in the prior decade, from 2000 to 2010. And what this shows is that you will see a pretty big spike for a couple age groups there. Very high net in-migration rates of individuals 30 to 34 and 35 to 39. Higher than any other in-migration rate of any age group. You also see high in-migration rates of the 0 to 4, 5 to 9, and 10 to 14. That's probably those individuals' children that they're bringing along with them. So if we hit the next bar, we see the 1990s, a very similar pattern. And hit the next one, please. 1980s, rates not as high, but very similar pattern as well. So that age group has been a key driver of population growth in St. Croix County throughout the past 3 decades. Can we go to the next slide, please? This looks at the population age 30 to 39, that key demographic segment in the entire Minneapolis, St. Paul, Bloomington metropolitan statistical area. And this goes back to 1980 and goes forward with projections to the year 2040. And we can see that that population peaked in the mid-1990s. That age group is gradually getting smaller going forward. So there will be fewer of these individuals present in the metropolitan area who may want to move to St. Croix County. So that segment of the market will be declining somewhat. Now it will start getting bigger again around 2030, but that's where the challenge arises in terms that we do not necessarily know what types of homes and what types of communities and what types of locations these individuals want to live in the future. So it's something to keep in mind. Next one. So also this is just another perspective. That's the percentage of the population that's comprised by the age 30 to 39 cohort. And you can see that it made up a fairly large share of the metro area population back in the 1990s, and it's gradually getting smaller in terms of a total share. So there'll be less of those individuals. The other thing to keep in mind is that we are still coming out of a challenging housing market in some ways. Things are greatly improved, but St. Croix County had one of the highest foreclosure rates in the state of Wisconsin in the last part of the prior decade. This compares state of Wisconsin foreclosure rates from the year 2000 to the year 2013. The rate is the number of foreclosure filings per 100 housing units. And here we can see that certainly we saw the spike in the state of Wisconsin around 2007 to 2010, but we can see that it was almost double that in St. Croix County. This is not a reflection of market supply and demand by any stretch of the imagination, but the reality is that loan approval rates and other factors that were driven by some of these numbers are still lingering somewhat. So it's something to keep in mind going forward. And this is just an animation. So if you just hit it once, this just shows the foreclosure rate. So you can kind of compare what happened in St. Croix County compared to other parts of the state. The darker the green, the higher the foreclosure rate in a given census tract. And you'll see that really in the late 2000s, you can see that that entire western part of Wisconsin saw very high foreclosure rates relative to other parts of the state. With that, I'm going to turn it over to Tom, and he will share some more information with you about some of the population projections that he's developed for St. Croix County and these corridor communities, and his perspectives on what this might look like going forward over the next few decades. Tom?
Thank you, Matt. Mr. Chair, members of the board, my name is Tom Gillespie. I was contracted to prepare population projections for St. Croix County to 2050, and in doing that, I looked at both some of the short-run trends, recent past, current trends that we see for the county, as well as the kinds of future changes that we might see. One of the biggest things that happened and was fairly unexpected by many folks was that we saw a tremendous drop-off in some of the fastest growing counties of the nation in their growth rate from about the 2005 onward, really as a result of the housing market. The Twin City metropolitan area was pretty characteristic of this. Where we were different was that among the Frost Belt states and Frost Belt regions of the country, that the Twin City metropolitan area had some of the fastest growing counties in the nation. That is really quite exceptional. Isanti and Chisago counties up 35 just to the north of Washington County. We're in the top 100 fastest growing counties, as were Wright and Sherburne counties on the road to St. Cloud, and Scott and Carver counties in the southwest metropolitan area, and St. Croix County, Wisconsin, all were among the fastest 100 growing counties of the nation, and represented a very, very strong growth. And this growth was really started in the 70s and continued through most of the 80s and 90s and through the first half of the aughts, and then around 2005 we began to see a break in this region as well as nationally, and some of the fastest growing counties were the ones that saw the biggest plummets in population growth, and we saw the central cities of the nation that had actually been declining in population for over half a century begin to experience some growth. Next slide, please. This merely reinforces that, looking specifically at St. Croix County since 1990, and you can see the very rapid drop-off in population growth, and we reached a low point around 2010, and we've sort of stayed in that range for the last few years. Next slide, please. What really happened was that we saw an enormous drop-off in migration. This happened nationally. The United States has been known as an extremely mobile society ever since our beginning. We've always been known as a nation that moved around a lot, and that people went to where the opportunities are. That really changed around 2006, 2007. We saw a dramatic drop-off in the United States. We now are at record low levels of mobility nationally. That is true in Minnesota, it is true in Wisconsin, and St. Croix County is certainly an example of this, where for really the last 3 years we've seen no real net migration, about the same number of people moving out as moving in. That is the short-run situation that we see in the county growth. Next slide. In the longer run, St. Croix County, of course, is part of the Twin City metropolitan area and influenced strongly by growth in the Twin City metropolitan area. The the Twin City metropolitan area is a strong growth area, at least among the Frost Belt metropolitan areas in the northeast and midwest portion of the United States. But the expectation, the forecast right now is for a dramatic slowing in population growth. That is also consistent with the projection of a national slowing in population growth. It is not because this region is exceptional, but rather we will be reflecting many of the national trends in growth. In the longer run, in addition to economic considerations, housing considerations, two other things that we really need to look at that are influencing population growth are aging of the population. One, so old people tend not to move. It's the young people in their 20s and 30s that move a lot, and that's simply we are aging as a society, and the population in their 60s and 70s is increasing very, very rapidly. The other group, the house buying group, is this millennial generation that at least right now is showing little tendency to purchase housing, and when they do purchase housing, they tend to purchase it closer into to central cities and not in what has been the faster growing suburban and exurban counties of the nation. That could potentially change, but there are apparently right now there are some strongly held personal opinions about housing preferences, about wanting to live in a smaller house closer in with less commuting, and that is coupled with some of the economic considerations that well, we all know millennials have really had a tough time getting traction going in their careers, and that is also slowing down the housing market. Next slide. Those pieces of information, as well as other pieces of information in our back pocket, the approach used is a very traditional demographic approach called the cohort component method for projecting population. And what we do there is project the number of babies born, the number of people who die, and migration based upon the age, gender profile of the county. Minnesota and Wisconsin are among the longest lived populations of the United States and in fact in the world, and that is reflected in the life expectancy and mortality expectations, that this is simply a very long-lived population, and so the life table used is one that is appropriate for this population. Births, on the other hand, tend to be more near the average in terms of fertility rates for the nation, and use those fertility rates as well. Migration is, of course, the big question mark, and in terms of impact of the bridge. In this, I looked at the age and gender profile of St. Croix County for each decade over the past 60 years in terms of migration profiles to develop assumptions about profile in the future. I prepared alternative models of projection. The three most likely, I did do the two extreme situations just for bracketing, but the three most likely are reflected here. The first model, this is all starting in 2015, so we're starting a month from now, and looking out to 2050, and this first model assumes a continuation of the current out-migration tendency of the county, basically continuation of where we are right now through the next 5 years, followed by a period of rapid in-migration, roughly equivalent to the kind of in-migration that we saw during the 1990s. And then after 2025, slowing down to a rate more similar to what we saw in the 1960s. The second model assumes a very steady kind of migration profile, very much like the 80s, that would still represent a rather substantial departure from where we are right at the moment. That would assume a substantial bump upward in migration. Model 3 assumes a very rapid start after the bridge completion, with rates approximating what we saw in the 90s over the next 5 years, slowing to something closer to what we saw for the 1980s as we move into the out years. Next. The results of these models are shown here, and also the green line with the triangles, the higher one with the triangles, reflects the projections for that are the official Wisconsin state projections at this time. As it turns out, the Model 3 and the official state projections are virtually identical. Again, this would be a scenario where we would see very, very rapid, immediate growth upon completion of the bridge. You would notice that very quickly, that as soon as the bridge is completed, there would be all sorts of sales activity going on immediately. That results in a 2050 population of just above 122,000 people. The other two models are the two lower lines. The Model 1, as you can see, assumes that we continue on this current situation for the next 5 years, and then experience very rapid growth for a period of 5 years, moderating after that. Model 2 assumes a fairly constant level of migration, which is probably not terribly appropriate for in the next 5 years, given that there will be a major change in infrastructure. But we can see here that the lower projection results in a 2050 population of about 107,000 people. The upper projection results in a population of about 122,000 people by the end of the 2050 period. Next slide. We also looked at the highest impact area, as Matt pointed out, the towns of St. Joseph, Village of Somerset, Town of Somerset, the Village of North Hudson, and the City of New Richmond, Town of New Richmond, Star Prairie, the Town of Star Prairie, and looked at the impact in that area. Next slide. Using the same models, we have a projection going out, assuming that the rate of growth is about 38% of the total county's population growth. That has actually been an almost constant for over 4 decades. We could assume that would increase or decrease, but that is a fairly stable number. And then those projections result in population projections for the most impacted area for 2040 range from about nearly 42,000 people to down to about 37,500 people as a range in population.
In addition to just raw population growth, we also have to consider how the age structure of the county may be changing as well. And one of the things that Tom mentioned is that we are aging. we're aging as a nation, we're aging as a metro area, and we're aging as a county. So we can look at, for instance, the number of people turning age 18 in a given year and compare that to the number of people turning age 65 in a given year. And I use this chart as a way to show how a county or a region may be aging, because this is one way of estimating the number of people entering the labor force at a given time and the number of people perhaps exiting the labor force at a given time. So this is looked at more from a labor force or economic development perspective. Now, certainly individuals can enter the labor force before the age of 18, and they may certainly stay in the labor force after the age of 65, but these are traditional entry and exit type years for individuals. So if you could just hit the first one. So this looks at the number of residents turning age 18 in a five-year period from 2010 going out to the year 2040. And you can see it gradually increasing from 2010 out to about 2020, leveling off a bit, and then increasing slightly in 2035 and 2040. If you go to the next slide, these are the number of people turning age 65 in those same periods. And if you look at 2010, there were almost twice as many people turning age 18 as were turning age 65 in St. Croix County. And if you go forward, the gap closes considerably. If you look at the year 2025, just 10 years from now, there is very little gap between the number of individuals turning age 18 in a given year and the number of people turning age 65 in a given year. So this has implications certainly for the labor force. This is not just occurring here. This is occurring in counties throughout western Wisconsin and throughout the metropolitan area as well. But it also has implications for housing. As these individuals get older, and 65 certainly is not old by any stretch of the imagination, but as these individuals approach retirement age and decide where they want to live, we're seeing some trends where they want to be closer to amenities, things like healthcare, things like retail, things like services. They want to be close to transportation options, and they want to have the types of homes that they can stay in long term. So that could certainly not just change how our community looks in terms of its labor force, but also in terms of the types of housing that may be desired across St. Croix County communities. Next slide, please. Certainly we can also look at the school age population. So we can look at the individuals ages 5 to about 19. We can't break it down to 18 or 17, but we can look at the broad trend in individuals of these different age groups moving forward. And we do see, as Tom would suggest, with the population growth, we do see a growth of school-age individuals as well. And this is going to vary from year to year and by segment, but for the most part, the growth of school-age population will continue in St. Croix County. Now that said, population projections are a useful tool, but they are by no means an absolute. That there are a lot of unknowns going forward. So I think one of the key lessons from looking at these population projections is that they should be used as a tool for policy development, not necessarily numbers that are set in stone. So if a community decides they want to try and grow more than they're projected to, there are certainly things that they can try and do to influence that growth. If a community decides they don't want the growth, there are things they can do as well to try and change that growth pattern. So they need to decide how and if they want to grow and the types of residents they want to attract. So the numbers will say one thing, but ultimately it's somewhat up to the communities themselves. And again, they're going to be influenced by the decisions of their neighbors. If one community decides they do not want high growth patterns or high growth rates in their community, they can do things that will change that, but it will likely push some of that growth into another part of the corridor or another part of the county. So what happens in one community is certainly going to influence what happens to its neighbors as well. And there's all sorts of tools that can be implemented. I'm not endorsing any of these or saying that they shouldn't be used, but there are things that are available to communities in terms of zoning restrictions and encouraging different types of developments that target millennials or target an aging community, marketing, financial incentives, lot size restrictions, and so on and so forth. These are all things that communities can consider when they want to try and influence their growth. And because of the unknown nature of projections going forward, I think it's highly useful for communities to benchmark key indicators of growth in their community. There's a lot of data out there. There are a lot of data out there that can be used by communities, things like traffic counts and building permits and school enrollment levels and demand for county services and emergency calls. All these things are almost real-time indicators of what's happening in a given community in terms of population change. So these are numbers that can be used to look at how a community may be changing and whether or not the population projections that are being developed are reflecting what's happening in reality. Let's move a little bit from population into economic development. And I think this is a good transition because when we think about where people decide where to live, one of the things they decide on is how long their commuting time is going to be, and also how many jobs they have accessible to them within a given drive time of where they're deciding to live. And again, this is just one factor that people use when deciding where to live. There are many other things that go into this, anything from home values to school quality to quality of life and so on and so forth. But it is an important consideration when thinking about access to jobs in the corridor in the county. So one of the things that we did was to model how accessibility to jobs would change before and after the river crossing was completed. So we looked at the number of jobs that were available within different drive times, 15 minutes, 30 minutes, and 45 minutes, before the river crossing was completed, and looking at the penalty that typically occurs in travel time. And then once we remove that barrier, how many jobs are available within these drive times after that. And these are based on morning commute times, so these are peak commute times as well. So they still recognize that there will be traffic congestion in other parts of the metro area, despite the river crossing being completed. So if we look at the number of jobs accessible before and after the river crossing completing from Holton, so we're right at the foot of the bridge, the number of jobs within a 15-minute drive time, 30-minute drive time, and 45-minute drive time, we can see that the number of jobs increases dramatically in terms of the accessibility of those jobs within primarily the metropolitan area. Especially within 45 minutes, we see the number of jobs within a 45-minute drive time more than double after the bridge crossing has been completed. So that is a huge barrier that's lifted for a number of commuters and potential commuters going forward. The thing that we need to consider here, though, is that even with this barrier removed, there are other places within the metropolitan area that have even greater accessibility than a community like Holton. So if we hit the next one. This compares the number of jobs accessible from Holton after the river crossing completion, and also compares it to the number of jobs accessible within similar drive times from Shakopee, Minnesota. And we use Shakopee because that's often used as a comparison because it sits at the foot of the Bloomington Ferry Bridge, and it's another community locally within the metropolitan area. So even after the travel barrier's been lifted, the bottleneck's been lifted, and the river crossing's complete, a place like Shakopee still has more jobs available within these drive times than a community like Holton. So the additional accessibility is very important, it's very beneficial, but the reality is that corridor communities will also have to compete for residents on other characteristics as well, other than just accessibility. Things like school quality, things like housing costs, things like quality of life, things like job availability, and so on and so forth. Next slide, please. We also need to realize that population growth in communities is going to drive demand for certain goods and services. That as people come in and reside in the community, they're going to bring additional income with them that will spur demand for all sorts of types of goods and services. Primarily, these demands are going to come in retail categories, hospitality categories, healthcare, construction, real estate, and personal services. Looking at a 10-year projection, depending upon which model we use, the two models that Tom talked about, the new income from residents will generate approximately 750 to 850 private sector jobs alone over the next decade or so within these sectors. One of the issues that need to be considered, though, is that even though people may have this money in their communities, there has to be opportunities for them to spend that money locally. And if we look at sales tax revenues in different retail and service categories for St. Croix County, we do see a notable amount of leakage going out of the community. That is, people are spending money in other parts of the metro area or other parts of Wisconsin. And some of this may be due to commuters. So they may be spending some of their income closer to their place of work than they're closer to their place of residence. So along with this new population growth will come income, but there has to be a plan to try and develop businesses that capture this new spending. And certainly with new population and new households comes additional costs as well. So new households in a community will create additional demand for protective services. They'll create new additional demand for public infrastructure. They'll create new additional demand for school districts. So we have to realize that with growth comes costs as well. So one of the things that we've tried to do is develop a series of spreadsheets that will help people identify what some of these costs of community services may look like going forward based on different assumptions that a community may make, based on the type of population that may be coming in, and based on capacity that they already have in some of their community infrastructure. Just as a rule of thumb, and this doesn't mean that this will be true going forward necessarily, but over the past 2 decades, St. Croix County has had approximately 45 to 50 local government employees for every 1,000 residents. And when I say that, that's not just local government in terms of St. Croix County government itself. That is all the school districts, that's public administration at the local level, that's protective services, that's public works. That is across every administrative unit in the county of St. Croix, so not just St. Croix County itself. That said, that ratio, that 45 to 50, again, it could be different going forward. That's typically lower than you've seen in some of the other comparable communities that we looked at. It's lower than the ratio we saw in Scott County, and it's also lower than we saw in the Discovery Bridge project in Missouri. So just something to keep in mind. When we look at economic development opportunities that will occur from the corridor's perspective and from the county's perspective, there's a good chance that this will occur in an incremental manner. While relocations of large firms to the corridor may happen because of the bridge, they're probably less probable for a couple of reasons that I'll go into here in a second. The reality is that most job growth in the region and the county is driven by expansions of existing businesses and by new startups. And a lot of these expansions and startups occur in smaller businesses. They may occur in larger businesses as well, but for the most part, they tend to be smaller. And I'll show you some data on this just here in a second. Large-scale relocations do occur, but are relatively infrequent compared to firms of other sizes. And again, I'll show you some numbers here in a second. And the reality is, because of those trends, communities should be prepared to offer space to smaller businesses and entrepreneurs. These individuals have a lot of needs that are going to be need to be provided by communities, or not just by communities themselves, but by resources in the region or throughout the state. They'll need access to broadband services. They'll need technical assistance. They'll need assistance in workforce development, and they'll need access to capital. So let's look at this in a little more detail. Let's go to the next slide. We can break down components of job growth into 3 different areas of net job growth. We can look at net job growth that occurs through expansions of existing companies. So existing companies that are adding businesses minus those that are subtracted, or minus those that are losing businesses. So if you have more companies that are adding, existing companies that are adding employees than those that are losing them, we have a net growth in expansions. We can also look at growth that occurs through net openings. So jobs that are created by businesses opening versus those that are closing. You can go to the next one. So we see the share there from net expansions, the dark blue line, and then the share of job growth that occurs from net openings. We can also look at the job growth that's created through the net relocations of existing businesses. Businesses moving in or out of a given county. And go to the last one here. And here, oh, I'm sorry, you go back one. And here we see that for all counties in the Minneapolis-St. Paul MSA, the vast majority of jobs are created by existing firms and by new firms that are starting. Even in the fastest growing counties like Scott County, we see the vast majority of jobs are from net startups and are from net expansions. Relocations do occur, and they are an important part of economic development. I would never say that we should not be focusing on industry attraction or relocations. That's a very important part of economic development, but most of it does come from existing firms and from new firms. We can also look at this in terms of how business expansion, contractions, and relocations occur among firms of different employment sizes. So we can break this down into 5 different categories, and this comes from the Edward Lowe Foundation, who has done a lot of work in stage 2 high growth companies. And we can look at self-employed companies. We can look at what are so-called stage 1 companies, companies that typically have 2 to 9 employees, that are typically smaller partnerships or startups that are still trying to get some footage or might be a lifestyle business. We can look at stage 2 businesses, which tend to have 10 to 99 employees. larger firms, which are stage 3, 100 to 499, and then very large firms, which are stage 4, 500 or more employees. Okay, next slide, please. This looks at establishments relocating to the Minneapolis MSA by these different business stages. And this looks at number of establishments relocating in a given year, starting in 1995, going up to the year 2013. If you hit the first one. These are the number of relocations of self-employed individuals. And we can see a fairly large number starting in about 2000, dipping it down a bit in the mid-2000s, and then skyrocketing really with the recession. That makes a lot of sense. And then dipping back down. This is stage 1. So a lot of relocations occurring among stage 1 firms. Let's go to stage 2. We see a similar amount, but lower amount, or similar trend, excuse me, but a lower amount. We see a gradual increase in relocations of stage 2 firms. That's stage 3. And the next one, stage 4. So within the entire Minneapolis-St. Paul metropolitan area, firms relocating from outside the metro area, inside the metro area, there is a very few number of large firms doing that in a given year. And that also means that you're in competition with many, many, many other communities around the Minneapolis-St. Paul metro area that are also trying to attract those same firms. We can also look at this from another perspective. These are what are called expansion startups. So these are essentially spin-offs of existing firms. These are existing companies that may be starting a new location, a new establishment, a new franchise, or something like that. Let's look at these, a similar trend. They're self-employed, very few. Stage 1 kind of bounces around. Stage 2 has been very high over the last couple of years in terms of the total number of expansion startups. Stage 3 has been relatively low, and stage 4 is fairly low again. So that does not mean that these relocations of large firms do not occur. They do. They're important to communities. They're big wins for communities. But a lot of the growth occurs from these smaller businesses that are both expanding or starting out. It's also important to realize that if we look at the distribution of employment across these different stages, that most employment is also concentrated in small businesses. So this looks at the total employment by establishment stage from 95 to 2012 in the United States. So if we hit the first one, that's the total number of employees that are found in self-employed establishments. Stage 1, very large number. Stage 2, by far the highest number of employees are found in stage 2 firms, these small to mid-sized firms. Stage 3, and stage 4. The number of employees in stage 4 firms has actually been declining since the 2001 recession, which makes a lot of sense. Big firms are not necessarily growing through adding employees, they're growing through creating new efficiencies, new levels of productivity that do not necessarily include new employees. If we look at St. Croix County, the distribution is very, very similar. The vast majority of employees are found in these stage 2 firms, these 10 to 99 employee firms, and they're also stage 1, and you see the gradual growth in the number of individuals employed in stage 1 firms. So again, large relocations do occur. Large companies are very, very important to our communities, but a lot of the economic activity that occurs in terms of expansions and startups tend to be in these small to mid-sized firms. One thing that the crossing does do is it creates better connections, obviously, between St. Croix County and corridor communities with the entire metropolitan area. It removes that bottleneck and allows goods and services and commuters to travel more efficiently from corridor communities into the metropolitan area and to markets and customers there. And one of the things we looked at is how freight flows in and out of the metropolitan area for freight that's transported on trucks. And this is from the Federal Highway Administration, and they've actually looked at where the major freight corridors are across the United States. And if you look at that distribution, those dark lines, those dark red lines are the major freight corridors for the entire United States. And you'll notice that a lot of the freight traffic in terms of major freight corridors that flows out of the Twin Cities flows to the southeast. It flows to places like Chicago, it flows to Indianapolis, it flows to the eastern seaboard through Chicago and other large metropolises throughout the eastern part of the United States. That said, there is a fair amount of freight traffic that does go west. It goes to the the Great Plains states. It goes out to Seattle and gets put on container ships to be transported overseas. But the vast majority of it travels southeast rather than to the west. So what's that mean for the crossing? What that means is it does not necessarily create additional opportunities if you are a company that's trying to look at transporting freight to the west. If you're looking at transporting freight to the east, you can already be on the Wisconsin side of the river crossing. If you're trying to transport freight to the west, despite the fact that the river crossing has lower congestion and increased accessibility to the metro area, it still means you need to traverse the entire metropolitan area to get your freight to the other side of the metro area. So there are opportunities on the western side of the metro area to access western markets if those are your key markets. Doesn't mean that you don't serve many markets, but again, it does not necessarily provide a great comparative advantage for transporting freight in between metropolises across the country. That said, I mentioned that it creates better connections to the metro area. So if you are a company that is trying to serve customers in the metropolitan area, it does lower resistance. So a lot of firms that may be trying to reach customer bases in the metropolitan area could find a comparative advantage because of the crossing. So what it does is that if you're a firm like a metal fabricator or plastics fabricator that depends upon just-in-time type delivery or quick order turnarounds, you can probably benefit from locating next to the crossing because it lowers that accessibility issue. It also provides access to these large industry clusters that are present in the Minneapolis-St. Paul region. And by industry clusters, I mean these are specializations that are kind of foundations of the regional economy. So industries like medical devices, lighting and electrical equipment, processed food, metal manufacturing, financial services, publishing and printing, and so on and so forth. These are very key driving industries of the metro area economy that have been identified. And because of the crossing, you may find opportunities to better serve or be part of these key industry concentrations in St. Croix County. And you're already heavily dependent upon them or part of them already, but again, you have better access to some of them now. Just an example.
Matt?
Yes.
Just in the interest of time, could we wrap up within the next few minutes? Because
We're very close to the end.
cool, thank
very
you.
much. Yep. So if you just go to the next one. This just shows the concentration of food manufacturing, food processing, and you do see the metro area as one of the, not greatest concentration, but a very high concentration. So that's a core industry that if you're a supplier to that industry in terms of a wholesaler or other types of good or service provider, you may find better access to those firms because of the crossing. Next slide. Why don't we skip over that one and just go to the next one. The other thing that the crossing does is that it certainly creates accessibility to jobs in the metro area for commuters, but we have to remember that the bridge goes both ways. That it also increases accessibility to labor in the metropolitan area as well. And one of the things that's a true strength of the Minneapolis-St. Paul metro area is that it has one of the highest levels of educational attainment in terms of individuals with a college degree among large metro areas in the entire country. In fact, it's ranked about 10th in terms of large metro areas with the share of its individuals that have a college degree or higher. And you'll see the top 25 there in Minneapolis highlighted in red. So what this does is it provides access to a very educated labor force in the metro area as well. If we go to the next slide. One of the things that we find is that some of the industries that have high concentrations of college graduates tend to be industries like professional, scientific, and technical services. And if you look at the share of employment in the Minneapolis-St. Paul metro area, it has a higher share of individuals working in those industries than St. Croix County. It's almost twice as much right now in terms of the share of individuals in professional, scientific, and technical services. So why not have an opportunity when you provide access to a very highly educated workforce throughout the metro area to grow some of these industries locally as well, because you have access to that talent. Next one. Another one is financial and insurance employment. And again, the share of total employment in Minneapolis-St. Paul, it tends to be quite a bit higher than we see in St. Croix County on a relative basis. But again, you have access to those individuals now in part because of the river crossing. It provides better access to talent. Finally, I want to wrap up with a couple other economic development observations. And again, there are more in the final report, but just want to highlight a little bit about the bike and pedestrian trail and what that might mean for economic development opportunities. There's a fair amount of research out there that looks at bike and pedestrian trail economic impact. And certainly it generates economic impact from users, people that are using the bike trail, spending money in local businesses and traveling to the communities to use those trails. It also creates quality of life considerations. As people are looking at a community, this might be an amenity that may attract them or help attract them to a community. But until the trail system is fully built out and until there are businesses in place to take advantage of them on the Wisconsin side, these economic impacts will be developed probably down the road a little bit more. Right now, the trail system has much more access to businesses in Stillwater, in downtown Stillwater, than it does on the Wisconsin side. But as the trail system is developed and put in place, there may be opportunities to build businesses and other types of opportunities to create that spending on the Wisconsin side as well. But again, that has to happen down the road. And finally, we're looking at all these economic development trends that are occurring and perhaps opportunities going forward. And as with population growth, that does not mean that you do not have the opportunity to shape economic development in your own communities. Again, there are potential opportunities to accommodate large firms. You have to be ready for them. And again, you have to realize that local communities do have opportunities to shape these strategies moving forward as well. And with that, I believe that's, final points, sorry. Final points of emphasis, just to hit on some of the things we talked about briefly today. You have an opportunity to shape what's going to happen going forward. I would suggest monitoring what's going on in communities, benchmarking, so we can respond to things in more real time than waiting as things occur going forward. Over planning today, fostering cross-community collaboration among different communities across the corridor, and again, maintaining realistic expectations. Relying on some of the information that's here and relying on what we're seeing in communities going forward. And with that, I thank you for your time. I'd like to thank Tom as well for his work on this project. He's been a very tremendous asset to this. And do we have a few minutes for questions?
Are there any questions from either the public or the board? I do, oh yes, go ahead.
So what's your gut tell you? Are we going to have net loss of migration still for the next 5 years like some of the models show, or is it going to be more like the state model? Or you're just going to say, I don't know?
My wife usually tells me not to trust my gut, but I think that's probably a question that Tom can better answer than I can. Not trying to throw Tom under the bus, but he is one that has developed these projections more so than I have.
His gut tells him to punt. It's one of these kind of things that there is uncertainty. And we live in a very uncertain world. But here, at least, we would know pretty soon. Completion of the bridge, you should know within the first year. If you start seeing a lot of growth, a tremendous amount of growth, I think you're going to be on that higher curve. It in part depends on what's going to happen to the national and global economies, the housing market. There are just so many unknowns. But I think at least this brackets a most likely scenario. And you should know very quickly after the completion of the bridge as to which line you're going to be jumping onto.
Are there any other questions?
Speaking of Hudson and the Highway 35 connection, did you get any impressions that connection right
Right. So we tried to keep our emphasis on those 8 communities. So we didn't really look specifically at Hudson. I mean, certainly access with Highway 35 up to the new crossing could spur some, and 94. I think the issue with Hudson is because you already have the 94 crossing, I don't know how the river crossing will influence those commuting patterns somewhat.
Whenever something happens with the, it really changes.
It does. It pushes commuters down to the I-94 crossing. So it'll relieve congestion undoubtedly. And but in terms of population or economic growth, we again focused on those 8 municipalities in the county.
Are there any other further questions?
Oh,
Supervisor
Jill has one.
Berkey?
Jill.
Just one other question with respect to tourism and hotel, motel accommodations. What kind of trend do you see happening with respect to these communities that you have highlighted, if any?
I think that a lot of it goes into where communities want to place their emphasis. So if they do want to try and emphasize tourist attraction, tourist development, that's going to depend upon whether or not they want to highlight their assets, how they want to market those assets. So it's again, it's going to be, I think, shaped more by the individual communities and how they decide to respond to the crossing.
Supervisor Rain?
Just on that note, the committee that reviewed this included a public and private sector group of people who got a preview of some of this information, and we often felt like we were drinking from a fire hose, and if that's how you feel today, I understand. I think the whole idea behind this was to help give, again, public and private entities a baseline of information for what impacts this might have. And what we see is that in the 8 communities we've identified that about 50% of the projected growth is going to go there. And so there is a lot of pressure to figure out where do you want to be on that continuum. I see Chris Strait from the West Central Regional Planning Commission is here, and he's doing the comprehensive plan for the town of Somerset. So that's an example. I see a lot of Bike and Pedestrian Coalition members here. I think what this information does is provide some idea of what are the things from a policy standpoint should we be considering, and we want to just get that information out there just to identify what the impacts of the bridge might be. There will be another public presentation made by Matt coming up in the city of New Richmond, which will be held in the evening, and so there will be more opportunities for questions and to have the public respond there. But on behalf of the committee, and the board, really appreciate your work, and thank you very much. Matt, it's been a pleasure working with you.